my last YouTube video, I mentioned that I wanted to rescale a buck 110. So looking below, we have some of the materials that you're gonna need to accomplish this. First and foremost, you're gonna need a buck 110, and you're gonna have to take these scales off. You'll notice that they're held in place with pins. In order to get those pins out, you need a carbide tungsten cutting bit, and you're gonna drill out or sand down those pins with this bit and a Dremel. Once they're sanded down, we'll show you how to do that later in the video. You're gonna need a punch. You're gonna punch those out, and then you're gonna pop them out with a putty knife. I prefer plastic because it tends not to mar up the brass. And of course, you're gonna need scales of your choice, and hopefully that's gonna make the difference between a standard buck 110 and a custom knife. You'll notice below I have some hybrid, or rather this is buck-eyed burl wood that we use for this knife. Some Purple Heart for this knife here. And as I mentioned in my last video, I have some hybrid resin hackberry scales that I purchased on eBay. I'm really looking forward to that. There's lots of detail in those. I think they'll be very symmetrical once I get those on. So let's get started. All right, I've gone ahead and put painter's tape on the blade to protect it. And I've got my Dremel with the bit that's gonna drill out or sand down these pins. So let's get started. All right, you can see we've marred these scales up pretty well. We don't really care, they're coming off, but you can also notice that the pins have been sanded or drilled down flush or just below the scales. That'll be possible, make it possible for us to punch out these pins. That was pretty easy. See how it came out through the bottom? Then go ahead and pull those out again with my trusty rusty needle nose pliers. And that came right out. You don't want to lose this. This pin is very important because that's what's going to secure that blade lock back in later. So we're going to leave that there for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and push out the other pins. I went ahead and took out the pin or the lock mechanism. We're going to put that to the side. We're going to go ahead now and push out these pins. You're going to see that the scale popped out on its own. I didn't even have to pry it out, and they've cracked. Looks like these are coming out really easy. Sometimes they come out very easily, sometimes not so much. You'll notice that the pins are exposed there, and they're going to be pulled out with some pliers. So you just grab on those, pull them out. Not so easy sometimes to get it. Maybe if I had a better pair of pliers, we'd have that, but there we go. There's part of that pin that came out. Don't need that anymore. Sometimes when you pull that pin out, it gets a little marred such that it won't go back in. So what you can do is put that piece inside your Dremel tool and tighten it down, get a little sandpaper and take some of the burrs off so that we can get it back in. All right, I put this pin back in. I know there's a few people that have done this before that are kind of disagree with me on how I do this. I am not very good at pulling, or some people use pliers and kind of crimp that off. I haven't been very successful with that. What I end up doing is marring up that brass. So what I do is kind of flush it out, just push it so that it's flush with that vise there, and that'll be the one side. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take my Dremel tool and I'm going to sand off with the carbide bit and make that flush, and then I'm going to peen it with my ball hammer. All right, you can see where I've shortened that pin up. Now I'm going to do my best to peen it to get it to where it's flat. I may have to sand it down a little bit more on the sides to make sure. We don't want there to be any space in between that pin and your wood, or you're going to have a big gap there, and that's a big no-no. All right, let's see what we can do. It's still pinned. I think it'll be okay, or peened rather. Now, I've taken the old scale and to kind of see that this should be able to go right across that without any hang up. If it does, that tells me that that pin is flush enough to put a scale on. I think we're doing all right. You'll notice that it still has the ability to lock up. Doesn't matter if it's all marred up on the inside of the brass. Obviously, the scales are going to cover that. Where you have to be really careful, again, is on that edge. You want to make sure that you don't do anything with that edge, because if you put some divots in it, it's going to show up. It's going to look like you don't want it. So there you go. Anyway, you see that that's flush all the way across there. So we are now ready to set our scales. All right, we have the scales. We have the knife. We've removed the scales from the 110. We're going to place these scales on. You'll notice, you may have noticed when I was filming previously that I outlined the scales. I took one of the 110 scales and used it as a pattern. Obviously, when we pulled these off, we cracked them into several pieces, or I did, and that happened because I punched them a little too hard. That's okay if it comes out in 2 or 3 pieces. Just kind of put them together. Really what you need to do is you need to get the top line and the bottom line. Even if you don't get the sides, you've got to know this line and this line. You'll notice from some scales here, I've got a parallelogram, and that's what you're going to cut. And that's what you need to have, is those lines. So take your scale, place it there, get a permanent marker, trace around them, and then you're going to use your jigsaw here and cut those out, and then we're going to sand them. So let's do that. All right, you can easily see that the jigsaw, I did not cut a straight line, but I was very conservative that I made sure that I cut beyond my outline where I traced it. That way I can sand with the belt sander. Remember, you can take off, but you can't put on, so that'll help us determine how to fit these in, and then we'll cut off the sides after we do that. Let's get to the belt sander. All right, I have my disc sander on the side of my belt sander. I'm going to go ahead and, again, get these straight. I'm not going to take too much, a little at a time, and that way I'm going to keep going back and forth and getting those to fit into the 110. Remember, we're getting a parallelogram, but you can see where it's much too big to fit in there. I kind of will push one side in there. You wanted it flush. You've really got to get that in there flush. You don't ever want to see a gap in there. But if you turn around on the other side, you can see there's quite a bit that needs to be sanded. So again, I'm just going to keep sanding just a little bit on both sides, very carefully, until I am certain that those pieces are in there. In fact, when I get very close, I'm going to take some just regular sandpaper and kind of sand it onto the cement or the ground there, and that way I don't take too much, because that disc sander will sand very quickly, and pretty soon you'll do what I did with this pair of scales. You can see major gap there. You don't want to do that. All right, I've used the disc sander as much as I dare without going too far. If I put this piece in, you can see where it's just quite not fitting. So now I'm going to do some hand sanding. I don't know if that sandpaper is big enough, but this is what I would do, what I'm going to do. I'm going to just sand down on both sides and just kind of hand sand this until I fit it. And you probably don't want to watch this for the next 10 or 15 minutes, so we'll time lapse it. All right, unfortunately I think I've taken maybe a little too much off. I prefer to get a pinch fit in there. I didn't do that. I did exactly what I said could happen. You take too much off. I'm gonna go ahead and finish the build. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a slight gap in there. I'm a little neurotic when it comes to those things. I think if we're real careful and we put that in just right, we could probably salvage it. But again, it's just part of it. You just really have to be careful. There's just a slight gap in there, but that's part of what we do with these kinds of things. That's why it's not as easy as it looks, but it is doable. So we're gonna go ahead and go with it. I'm gonna do the other side, then we'll go ahead and glue these pieces in. And well, let's go ahead and get the other piece finished. Once I've kind of determined where exactly I want it in the 110, I'm gonna turn it over, use a Sharpie, and just draw lines on the inside of the scale. That way when I use my jigsaw, I know how much to take off. I may not take anything off on this side because I want a little room to play, but definitely on this bottom I don't need that much. But if I take that off, you can see there is the inside of the scale. I'm going to do this on both sides. All right, I've cut out the pieces. Again, you can see where I really got this one just perfectly pinch fit in there. It stays in on its own. This scale, on the other hand, not so much. There's going to be a little bit of a gap. Unfortunately, you're probably not going to notice it. I'm going to go ahead and finish the build regardless. We are going to go ahead and glue in the scales. So I've got my 2-part epoxy. Go ahead and squirt some of that stuff out. Put that lid back on. Don't ever want to cross lids, as you know. About 50-50. And I've got a toothpick to kind of mix that up. And we are going to take some of that, put it on the back side of this. I may have to get some more. There we go. You can put too much on, but not enough. You know, if it comes out the sides a little bit, life will go on. I think that's good. I'm gonna get that pinch fitted back to where it was. But, I mean, that one just really went in nicely. Now the other one I'm very annoyed with, as I said, but you know, I need to get over it. I get a little neurotic sometimes with my projects. But again, we're gonna finish this build. Put the remainder of that on there. I think I'm going to go ahead and mix just a little bit more. But better to have enough than not. Put that to the side, mix it up really good. And finish putting epoxy. You want to make sure that, try not to get the epoxy inside the lock. When you clamp this down, you're not going to be able to unlock it. I found that out the hard way. So I'm going to put this in. I'm kind of turning it as best I can to, just to minimize that gap. Now that I have them in there, I can kind of hold it for a minute. You can see where it's leaking out just a little bit. I put maybe too much in. So maybe take the back side of your toothpick and get it out. As long as it doesn't get inside there, you should be all right, and I don't think that's going to happen. Like I say, once you clamp these down, you're not going to be able to snap this because it's pretty tight. I just have a couple of clamps here. I'm going to put one on one side, and then on the other. We want this to dry about 6 to 8 hours, and then we can begin the sanding process. And you don't need a really heavy clamp. You don't want to squeeze all that out, but again, you do want it firm in place. Even if you have a couple of heavy books, that might work, but I think we're good there. This is ready to set up for 6 to 8 hours. All right, it's been about 6 hours since we glued the scales on this Buck 110. It's pretty solid. You can see it still has its snap. We are going to sand down using the belt sander, both sides, and then we will use some hand sanding. So let's get going on this. That the scales are starting to get pretty close down to the bolsters. You can see the liner on the side. It's at a point where I will probably start hand sanding. This resin is very soft, so it sands very quickly. So what I tend to do is actually I take a block of wood. That's actually a Jenga piece, and I'll put some sandpaper around it. I try to sand flat across the top. That way I ensure that it's flat, it doesn't get a lot of waves in it, and as I hand sand that down, believe it or not, it'll go pretty quickly and it will get sanded down flush with the bolsters. Alright, you can see we're getting closer. I had some 100 grain. I'm going to try some 220. You can see where it's flush with the liner. Now I need to get it flush with these bolsters. And anyway, we're not there yet. We've got quite a bit to do yet, but we're going to move on to some finer sandpaper. All right, I've been sanding for about an hour. I didn't video all that. Nobody wants to watch that, but you can see where I'm really getting close. There's some places where it's very smooth. You can tell where the bolsters touch the resin. However, there's some other places that need to be sanded down first before we can put an oil on it. I'm still doing 220. I'm going to go down as soon as I feel like it's really smooth, down to about 1,000 grain sandpaper, and then I'm going to go down to about 1,500, and I'm going to put an oil on that, buff it up, see what I can do. Never actually used resin and wood, but I think we're making progress here. All right, it's been a couple hours now, and you can see I think I finished it up. I started with the 220 grit sandpaper, then I went to 1,000, and then I went to 1,500, and I feel like I've got the scales pretty matched up to those bolsters. You can see that it's pretty much finished. It's gonna take an oil once I sand it just a little bit more, and I think it's gonna turn out all right. You can see the blue and the hackberry. I wanted a little more hackberry in there than I got, but it's blue. My youngest son really would like it. Well, all my sons would like it. We'll see where it goes, but let's see what it looks like once we put the stain on. Oil, really, we're gonna put just a light oil on there. We could either use linseed oil or neat's foot oil, probably use neat's foot oil. And then we're gonna polish up those bolsters with some white chalk and a buffing compound, and it's gonna be as good as new. All right, I've sanded as much as I want to. It's been a couple hours of sanding. It's not of the faint of heart. You've got to really work it, but I'm thinking it's gonna look really nice. Got a bottle of linseed oil here, and this sandpaper is 1,500 and it's wet dry. So I'm gonna kind of kill two birds with one stone. I'm just gonna dip my finger in there, put a little oil on that sandpaper, and then I'm gonna rub it in and sand. See what we can get. There, that's the sand. There's the side with the oil. That side doesn't have it yet. I'm telling you, it's very smooth. It's smooth as glass, as they say. Alright, it's getting in. It's pretty. Got a little rag here. I'm going to kind of wipe off the excess. I'll probably buff it with some wax to see if I can get it a little more shine, but it's pretty shiny right now. You can kind of see the different colors that they put in there. It's already popping out. I'm gonna sand it a little more. I'm really wanting to sand more of the resin, but I don't want that wood any darker than it is. And then I'm just gonna, again, take some of that excess off there. All right, you can see the bolsters are a dull color, but I promise you, once we buff those up, it's gonna look great. There it is. All right, one more task. That's got my cat coming in there. One more task, and we're gonna buff this, buff up the bolsters.
All right, we're on the back porch now, and the sun is behind us, so you might see that a little better. You can really see the shimmer from that resin. But we still want to polish up these bolsters, so I have my buffer behind me, got some white compound. I'm gonna add a little bit, buff it up, and should be brand new looking.
And there it is. I've polished those bolsters, put another wax on it. It's a little stiff. I need to oil it a bit, and of course it'll work its way out. You know, there's a lot of sand and dust in there, but considering where it was and what it was, I think it really turned out. I'm very pleased with it. That's hackberry with the blue resin. It's, I don't even know if the video can show you what it looks like, but there it is. Hope you enjoyed this build. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Don't forget to like or subscribe below.